On January 8, 1918, Woodrow Wilson gave the 14-point speech in an attempt to justify the fighting of World War I. He reassured the people that the war was being fought for the just cause of peace in Europe. Wilson's points represent a very idealistic view of the world. Some viewed his ideas as completely unrealistic. George Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France at the time, remarked that even the good Lord contented himself with only 10 commandments, and we should not try to improve upon them. By saying this, Clemenceau implied that Wilson was asking for far too much of the world, and that much of what he was asking for was unrealistic. Overall, Wilson proposed several things in his points, but the most emphasized were self-determination for nations, establishing open covenants of peace, absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas and peace and in war, the removal of all economic barriers, and the establishment of equality of trade. Some of these ideas were revolutionary, and some were far too idealistic. In this video, we will examine several of Wilson's points and talk about the pros and cons of his ideas, and whether or not they were realistic or too idealistic. Nations did not want to give up control of their colonies to their indigenous inhabitants, especially because they were too valuable. Germany was in no position to maintain its presence in Russia. Belgium and its independence were restored unanimously. Austria-Hungary was dissolved into two separate nations, as well as Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland. The Kingdom of Serbia, the state of Slavs, Croats, and Serbs, and parts of Montenegro united, and the Ottoman Empire did dissolve, creating Turkey and several smaller nations. The landscape of Eastern Europe was dramatically changed because of Wilson's original proposal. Self-determination was a key element and included in 9 of Wilson's 14 points. Self-determination is a nation's right to choose its own sovereignty without pressure of outside influences, such as other nations or ethnic groups. In his chief points, Wilson proposed that the future of colonies should be decided with the interest of its inhabitants coming first. Russia was to be left alone from outside interference as they went through a communist revolution. Belgium's independence was to be restored. Sovereignty for Austria-Hungary as its separate nations. Independence to the Balkan states of Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania. Sovereignty for Turkey and other nations and ethnic groups of the former Ottoman Empire, and finally, an independent Poland. The concept of self-determination is a noble idea, and Wilson had good intentions, and parts of it were too naive because the other victorious wanted to reap the rewards of war, including territories taken from other nations. However, these points did achieve independence from many nations at the Versailles Conference, mainly from the dismantling of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire.
Absolute freedom of navigation upon seas and borders outside territorial waters would create equal trade throughout all countries. This in turn would keep prices and taxes low for goods and services, as it would create global competition. This would also keep from creation of a monopoly of goods and services.
One of Wilson's points of emphasis was the formation of the League of Nations in point 14. Wilson's goals in creating the League of Nations were to prevent war through collective security and disarmament, as well as attempting to settle international disputes through negotiation. The League of Nations failed because of the unrealistic goals Wilson proposed. Overall, there were many good things that came about from Wilson's 14 points, and many things were achieved. But, because of Wilson's idealistic views and his unwillingness to compromise on any of his points, many of them failed.